Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today with my colleagues, Senator Blunt, Senator Blumenthal, and soon to be joining us, Senator Graham, to speak about our Cybersecurity Public Awareness Act of 2013. It is now broadly accepted in this body that the cyber threat posed by criminals, foreign intelligence and military services, and even terrorists is enormous and unrelenting. But useful information about cyber attacks and cyber risks still is not consistently available to consumers, to businesses, or to policymakers. The legislation that the four of us have introduced, the Cybersecurity Public Awareness Act, is an important first step toward fixing this problem. Senator Blunt has earned a reputation for working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, particularly on issues of national security. I was very glad to have the opportunity to work with him last year as part of a bipartisan group of senators seeking a sensible middle ground on cybersecurity legislation. He has brought his keen understanding of national security issues to bear on this important problem, as well as his expertise on public and private collaboration. So I thank the good senator from Missouri for the opportunity to work together with him. Likewise, Senator Graham, as my colleagues know, has a long track record of bipartisan legislative accomplishments and a passion for issues of national security. On our Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime and Terrorism, where together we are the chair and ranking member, Senator Graham has been a worthy partner in our work to improve America's cyber readiness, including our readiness against economic espionage and trade secret theft. I thank Senator Graham for his continuing leadership and partnership as we introduce this bill to improve public awareness of the cyber threats facing our country. And I'm pleased also to be joined by my colleague, Senator Blumenthal. We were attorneys general together. We serve on the Judiciary Committee together. We are Northeasterners together. And I know that he brings to this chamber a deep understanding of the tools at the disposal of law enforcement, as well as the challenges of adapting to a swiftly evolving threat. Americans' privacy is routinely violated by criminals who steal credit card information and Social Security numbers, or even spy on us through the webcams of our personal computers. Bank accounts of businesses, local governments, and individuals have been emptied overnight. Sensitive government networks have been compromised. The networks that run our critical infrastructure, the basics that we depend on for heat, for communications, for commerce, have been compromised, raising the prospect of a cyber attack that could bring down a portion of the electric grid or disrupt our financial system. Even our nation's long-term economic competitiveness is at risk. General Keith Alexander, the head of the National Security Agency and Cyber Command, has said, for example, that the theft of trade secrets through cyber hacks has put us on the losing end of the largest illicit transfer of wealth in history. Yet most Americans are still unaware of the full extent of this threat. Why? Cyber threat information is often classified when it is gathered by the government, or is held as proprietary when collected by a company that has been attacked. As a result, Americans are left in the dark about the frequency, extent, and intensity of these attacks. Raising awareness of cyber threats is an important element of Congress's work to improve our nation's cybersecurity. The Cybersecurity Public Awareness Act of 2013 takes up that challenge. Building on legislation I previously introduced with Senator John Kyle, it will increase public awareness of the cyber threats against our nation and do so in a manner that protects classified, business-sensitive, and proprietary information. The bill addresses several different elements of the cybersecurity awareness gap. It enhances public awareness of attacks on federal networks by requiring that the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense report to Congress on cyber incidents in the .gov and .mil domains. As we work to protect the American people from cyber attacks, we must first understand the nature of attacks on our own systems and what we can do to ensure that those attacks are not successful. The bill also tasks the Department of Justice and the FBI to report to Congress on their investigations and prosecutions of cyber intrusions, computer or network compromise, or other forms of illegal hacking. Those reports also must detail the resources that they devote to fighting cybercrime and any legal impediments they find that frustrate prosecutions of cyber criminals. It's not enough just to try to stop hackers when they're coming after us. We must also identify and prosecute the people responsible for cyber crimes, wherever they may be. In addition, the bill requires the Securities and Exchange Commission to report to Congress on the corporate reporting of cyber risk and cyber incidents in the financial statements of publicly traded companies. The purpose of this requirement is to make sure American businesses are adequately informing their shareholders of any material information shareholders should know relating to cybersecurity. Last, the bill requires the Department of Homeland Security to report to Congress on the vulnerabilities to cyber threat in each critical infrastructure sector: the electric grid, the gas and oil markets, the banking sector, and others. When it comes to protecting our critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, there is no margin of error. Failure in this area could mean a blackout in a major American city or a serious disruption of the banking system upon which our economy depends. That is why we must fully understand the threats to these sectors and what we can do to stop them. These are ways in which the Cybersecurity Public Awareness Act will help to better inform the American people about the nature of the cyber threats we face and help us in Congress make the informed decisions about how to better protect against these threats. We have more work to do to improve our nation's cybersecurity, but a key first step is to ensure that members of the public, businesses, shareholders, policymakers, and other cybersecurity stakeholders have an appropriate awareness of cyber vulnerabilities, threats, and opportunities. I look forward to working with Senator Blunt, with Senator Graham, and with Senator Blumenthal to get this bill passed into law, and I thank them each for their helpful cooperation and their insight. And I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Missouri.
I want to follow up on what Senator Whitehouse has been talking about. Certainly last year he and I tried to find the middle ground on this issue where members of the Senate and the House would be willing to move forward together to try to deal with it. I think this largely the potential damage and the potential danger of what this cyber threat means are both unknown, and if you do know about it, you don't quite understand what we could do about it or should do about it. And so we're coming together here again with Senator Blumenthal and Senator Graham to try to do what we can to have more information available as we move forward. There's no question that cyber breaches are serious. There's no question that they're a growing threat to our country's security. In my view, there's no question that it's our greatest vulnerability and a threat that we might not see coming if we don't do the right things, particularly as it might relate to the critical infrastructure outside of what the government monitors. Cyber attacks by criminals, by foreign intelligence, by military service, by terrorists have increased in frequency, have increased in what we see as the sophistication of those attacks, and these are very dangerous things for our country. They're certainly potentially dangerous in terms of the financial structure, the critical infrastructure, the ability to defend the country, and they've already resulted in billions of dollars of lost intellectual property. Millions of Americans have had their identities stolen, increased vulnerability to our critical infrastructure that's now so dependent on the cyber network for it to function. And, of course, what happens if that infrastructure, whether it's the transportation infrastructure or the energy infrastructure, the utility infrastructure, are compromised, and we don't know where that attack is coming from or how to meet it or how to prevent it. That's what we're trying to talk about in this legislation and trying to deal with. As early as 2007, cyber intrusions into United States government agencies and departments resulted in the loss of data that would be equal to everything across the street in the Library of Congress. Walk through the Library of Congress, look at everything there. We've lost that much government data since 2007. At the same time, really reliable information about cyber attacks, about cyber risk remain largely unavailable. Unavailable to consumers, unavailable to businesses, unavailable to policymakers. Threat information affecting, as my friend from Rhode Island said, .gov and .mil, the military side of what we do in the government, the non-military side of what we do in the government is largely classified. So we just frankly don't have much information about what they're doing every day, what they're fighting back every day, what the increased threat may be. And there are other entities that people are more familiar with, .com, .net, .org domains that frankly withhold information from the public because they don't want to needlessly concern their customers about using what's available or in some cases impact stockholders if stockholders knew how vulnerable a particular network might be. So I'm glad that we're working together to try to make this legislation, this Cybersecurity Public Awareness Act of 2013, just that. The two key words here are public awareness. We've looked at this long and hard to figure out where is the path that we can move forward, not just to introduce a piece of legislation, but a piece of legislation that our colleagues would respond to, a piece of legislation that our colleagues would look at and say, well, of course we need to know more than we know now about this, and through us, the people we work for need to know more. This gives us a greater understanding of the number of threats and the tools available to repeal those threats without needlessly compromising any of those tools that would be available to repel threats. This bill works to provide public awareness of the danger of cyber attacks in our government and private sector networks. It does that by instituting new reporting requirements for federal agencies charged with monitoring and responding to cyber threats. Specifically, the bill would require national security and law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, to submit reports to the Congress on what were the attacks on the federal network, what is the level of investigations of cyber crime, what other obstacles are out there to appropriate public awareness of what they put on the Internet, how they put it on the Internet, how vulnerable we may be to things that happen now that manage so many of the daily aspects of our life in the cyber world, and what are we doing about it? What are the cybersecurity threats, and to create an understanding that there is a way to respond, there's a way to share information, there's a way to make this work better. This bill will also include and does include provisions to enhance awareness of threats against our critical infrastructure. As I've said before, the critical infrastructure, whether it's financial, the utility infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, all are things that now are so woven into the cyber networks that the ability to suddenly manipulate, the ability to infiltrate is all there, and we want to be sure we're looking at those threats in the right way. It's clearly complex. There's somebody out there right now thinking about things that we wouldn't want them to think about as to how they can manipulate and use these networks in dangerous ways. It's complex. It's critical to our national security challenges. Our response can't and shouldn't be to break down on partisan lines. It shouldn't be a response that we decide we can't do anything because we can't figure out how to work together. And so, again, I'm pleased to be working with my colleagues on this. Both Senator Blumenthal and Senator Whitehouse have the background of being the attorney generals of their state, of understanding the importance of both honoring the law and enforcing the law and protecting us in this new area of vulnerability. We can't prevent cyber security threats, but we can respond to those threats. However, we can't really respond to those threats, in my view, and I think the view of everyone who's going to be speaking about this today, without public support. Having more information will make a difference. Understanding how big this problem is will make a difference. Working together to try to solve it is absolutely essential. I believe it is our greatest vulnerability as a society. It's a vulnerability that will increase over time or decrease over time, and that largely is up to how we deal with it. And so, again, I'm glad to join my colleagues and look forward to hearing what Senator Blumenthal has to say about this, and appreciate the important background that he brings to this debate. And I would yield.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm really pleased and honored to join my colleagues this morning, Senators Blunt and Whitehouse, and shortly Senator Graham, because they've really been leaders on issues involving national security and defense, and particularly in the intelligence and cyber area. Senator Blunt has a long record of bipartisan leadership in this body and in the House of Representatives and in government generally in addressing issues without regard to partisan predilections or biases. And he has not only led but produced results, and Senator Whitehouse has tirelessly pursued this area of cybersecurity. To his great credit, he has been with the movement toward making our nation more secure, but also making the public more aware about the need for action in this area. And in truth, there is a saying that ignorance is bliss, but in truth, in areas of national security, that is rarely the case. And in this instance, ignorance can do great harm. It is a source of peril, and our nation is largely ignorant about the threats posed by national security, and more important, about the potential responses that must be mobilized to secure our infrastructure, our critical, innovative information, and many other areas where we are at risk from a diverse source of threats. It's not only foreign governments like China, it is teenage hackers in Eastern European countries, it is terrorists around the world who mean to do us harm and put their own movements at an advantage, and also competitors in the private world that seek competitive advantage against our own private enterprise companies that have intellectual information and assets. As a result of these cyber attacks, intellectual property is lost, identities are stolen, and America is made less safe. Every day, the United States is under attack, literally every minute of every day. by individuals wishing to steal sensitive information from our government, from our Department of Defense, and from corporate information systems, as well as home networks of individual Internet users. The cyber threat has become almost conventional wisdom in some quarters because we know our military and our intelligence community are certain that this threat must be met. In fact, that the next Pearl Harbor will come not from the sky, but from a computer network that links to essential sources of intellectual assets and information in this country and degrades them or, in fact, destroys them. Senator Whitehouse and I, along with Senators Graham and Blunt, have introduced legislation that would institute new reporting requirements. These requirements apply to federal agencies charged with reviewing and responding to cyber attacks. In effect, the federal government would lead by example. And leadership is important not only for state and local governments, but also for the private sector. The legislation would help us better protect our country from hackers wishing to do harm, and it's based on the simple premise that we need to know about the threats that we face. Now, the President has taken action, and I credit him with the executive order that he has instituted, but that executive order leaves great gaps in what we will know, what will be reported to us by our federal agencies. And this bill would require that information to be submitted from a variety of agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, the Justice Department, and FBI, and in my view, most critically of all, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, most Americans have very little idea about what the Securities and Exchange Commission collects by way of information. But in fact, it is a treasure trove, a panorama and window into the workings of corporate America. Very importantly in this area, it can tell us what corporations, big and small, around the country are doing to protect themselves. It can tell shareholders what they should know. And the shareholders, after all, are the owners of these companies. And they ultimately will bear the financial burden of failures by corporate America to fulfill their duties to protect their critical infrastructure. Not only their shareholders, but neighbors living near power plants, as well as customers, banking customers, for example, whose critical financial information is entrusted to financial institutions. A vast variety of clients, customers, owners, and others affected by these corporations have a right to know from the Securities and Exchange Commission what is being done to protect against cyber attack. Senator Whitehouse and Senator Blunt have described in very powerful terms what the advantages of this legislation are. But let me say that equally important is what it does not do. And we need to be mindful that 90% of our nation's critical infrastructure, that's right, 90% of it, is owned by private companies, and those private entities have a responsibility to our nation to ensure their security standards meet the task of fending off cyber attacks. So this legislation should not be the only action that Congress takes. In fact, Senator Rockefeller has championed legislation that is essential. I'm proud to be a supporter of it. I supported it in the Commerce Committee and very gratefully to him partnered in helping to move it to the floor of the United States Senate. But this legislation is a very strong complement and supplement to that measure. In fact, that measure would require industry-driven, voluntary cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure. It would strengthen cyber research and development. It would improve the cyber workforce through development and education, and it would increase public awareness of cyber risks and cyber security. So the measure approved by the Commerce Committee, I think, is vital. And this measure very, very appropriately complements it. America can't fully address a threat that it doesn't fully understand. And this legislation that Senator Whitehouse, Senator Blunt, Senator Graham, and I have introduced would increase public understanding of an issue critical not only to the federal government, but to all American people. And it would ensure Americans know how they are safer or less safe as a result of the extraordinarily dangerous menace posed by potential cyber attack. So let me yield the floor with a question to Senator Whitehouse regarding the executive order issued by the President, and ask him whether, in light of that executive order, he still feels this legislation will perform a service to protect our nation.
I thank Senator Blumenthal for that question, and I thank him for his work in this area for some time now. He and Senator Graham and Senator Blunt and I were part of a group that tried to pull together a bipartisan compromise, a meaningful piece of cybersecurity legislation, which unfortunately failed at the last minute. And as a result of that failure, the President began a process by executive order for bringing together the various industries, the private sector industries in this country, whose operations qualify as critical infrastructure, that provide the basics of our lives, the basic heat, electricity, financial services, communications that modern life, civilized life, depends on. And that process, from all the reports that I've heard, and I've looked at it very closely, is actually going very smoothly, with the result that the administration is comfortable deferring legislative activity in that area, in the area of trying to regulate and improve the cybersecurity of our critical infrastructure. And so we're holding off for the time being on that, but the area of public awareness is still wide open. And legislative authorities are required, not just executive order authorities, in many of these areas, particularly for organizations like the Securities and Exchange Commission, which are largely independent of direct presidential control because they're independent agencies under our constitutional system. So this bill would not interfere with what is going on under the authority of the executive order. It is something that we can do in a bipartisan way in the meantime while that executive order process goes forward. And it will be, I believe, very productive because, as Senator Blumenthal and Senator Blunt have both noted, we are a better country and we are more effective legislators here in the Senate when the public knows what's going on and has had a chance to engage on an issue. And for that to happen, the public needs the information, and for the public to get that information, they need to have it collected by these different agencies and presented to them. You can't expect an average American citizen to go out and try to do this research on their own if it hasn't been gathered anywhere. So I appreciate the question. I think what we're doing is both going to be very productive but also very consistent with what the President has done under his executive order. I applaud him for picking up the baton after we failed in Congress. Certainly that failure had nothing to do with the energy and determination to get something done on this issue of Senator Graham, who has joined us on the floor. So let me yield the floor so that he can offer his thoughts.
Well, thank you very much. My first thought is America is not nearly as aware as we should be about the threats that we face from a cyber attack that can come from a terrorist organization, a nation state, or a criminal enterprise. We're a week before Christmas. we're going to be debating about how to deal with the NSA program, reforms that make it more acceptable to American people. But I just want to lend my voice. The three of the people who have already spoken, 3 senators, are, quite frankly, far more knowledgeable about the technological aspects of this. But when I look out over the next decade and then I try to figure where are the threats coming from against the American people, well, first, it's our debt problem, but we're not going to get into that today. When you look outside for foreign threats, obviously radical Islam presents a threat to us all. Just remember 9/11. But this emerging cyber threat really just scares the hell out of me. The FBI, the military, the CIA are telling us daily how the threat is growing. The Congress could not get there, so the President had to take over by executive order. We had a couple of good bipartisan proposals, legislative changes. Senator Whitehouse's idea of incentivizing the private sector, creating a Fort Cyber where you get rewarded. There'll be no limited liability if you harden your infrastructure in the energy sector and other important financial sector, rewarding people for upgrading their systems to harden them against terrorist attack or criminal activity, I think is the smart way to go. It's a complicated area of the economy and a complicated potential enemy to deal with. But this legislation, I think, is a good starting point. So I just want to compliment Senator Whitehouse, who has been really helpful. Senator Blunt on the Republican side has been our leading voice, along with Senator Chambliss, to try to bring awareness to the body. And Senator Blumenthal is the former Attorney General, understands very much the threats we face from a criminal enterprise, but he's also been very good on national security. So a week before Christmas in 2013, we're trying to raise awareness because I'm afraid that if we don't get our house in order against cyber attacks, sooner rather than later, we'll all regret it. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this effort. I yield.
Conclude our comments, or at least my comments here, by saying we all believe that greater awareness of the size of this problem and the effort that is being made every day to deal with it will create an important set of information as we move forward. This is a piece of legislation that is really focused on providing information, not in enough detail to weaken our efforts, but in enough information so that people know that this is not a casual conversation, that the cyber threat is real, that we're responding to it all the time, and frankly, members of Congress need to have even more information than we have on how much intensity, how much time, how much response is being made. And Senator Whitehouse, thanks for bringing this together.
Madam President, let me conclude for our side with the observation that in this season of peace and reconciliation, perhaps this is an issue where a little peace and reconciliation, a zone of peace and reconciliation can emerge through all of our partisan rancor so that we can go forward to do something that will indeed protect this country that we love. I yield the floor.
Madam President. Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
I would offer my own concluding remarks by saying that Senator Whitehouse earlier referred to our failure. He characterized it as a failure to accomplish legislation during the last session of Congress, and Senators Blunt and Graham were very instrumental in that effort, and I was proud to work with them. But that failure had consequences in alerting the executive branch and galvanizing their will to act. So I would not say that it was completely without consequence or benefit. And I hope that we will actually be successful during this session in passing legislation that is so important to moving the federal government even further in a direction where it should be going. Senator
would yield for a question. I might inquire of him whether it's his view that if you actually take a look at what's being done by the administration under the executive order, it bears a considerable resemblance to the proposal that we had worked on.
I thank Senator Whitehouse for that question, and I would observe, in fact, that the executive branch very importantly followed a number of the leading ideas that Senator Whitehouse and our group fashioned. And, of course, we take no pride of authorship or ownership in those ideas, and many of them came from some of the best minds in the administration who are, in fact, thinking seriously about this problem. And so I think it really has to be a partnership, not only a bipartisan partnership in the Senate and the Congress, but also a partnership between the executive and legislative branches. And I would just conclude with this thought. In many of the briefings that we had as senators, off the record or classified, I was struck by how horrified and at least alarmed most Americans would be if they heard some of the stories of how close America has come to the next Pearl Harbor, how close we have come to cyber catastrophe, and how vulnerable the nation still is, despite the growing awareness in both the corporate and military sectors of our country about this threat. So when we talk about creating awareness, we're talking literally about spreading information that is vital for Americans to know. And so I would close with the thought that I hope that the leaders of this country who have control over classifying information would seek ways to inform the American public about the risks and the dangers posed from cyber attack. Thank you, Madam President, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President, I ask if the chairperson of the Budget Committee, if she and I could engage in a brief dialogue, colloquy.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Madam President, I ask all proceedings on the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
I would say to my friend, the chairperson of the Budget Committee that has done extremely hard work on the budget agreement, are you aware, could I ask, that under the Simpson-Bowles plan, which was embraced by many, many members of this body, including on this side, including on the other side, including those who are now announced their opposition to the agreement, the Ryan Murray budget, that the Simpson-Bowles plan recommends scrapping COLAs, cost of living adjustment, entirely, not just cuts them, but the Simpson-Bowles plan, I wonder if the chairperson knows, eliminates COLAs entirely for working-age military retirees. The Simpson-Bowles plan, which was so embraced and everybody thought was the greatest thing since sliced bread, said, quote, defer cost of living adjustment, COLA, for retirees in the current system until age 62, including for civilian and military retirees who retire well before a conventional retirement age, in place of annual increases, provide a one-time catch-up adjustment at age 62, increase the benefit to the amount that would have been payable had full COLAs been in effect. So basically, what Simpson-Bowles recommended was scrapping the cost of living adjustment for working-age military retirees. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but the provision in your bill is a 1% reduction, far, far less than a scrapping it entirely as Simpson-Bowles. And I would ask again, Where was the outrage, to quote my old friend Bob Dole, where was the outrage when this provision in Simpson-Bowles was included, which would have scrapped it completely? And it wasn't through this Armed Services Committee. It was a Simpson-Bowles plan, which was a commission. I would ask the distinguished chairperson.
Madam President,
Senator from Washington.
the senator from Arizona is correct. The Simpson-Bowles Commission did pass. In their report, they asked for an elimination of the entire COLA, as he outlined in his opening remarks today. The budget bill before us took a different approach, and I appreciate him reminding all of us that that's out there.
And could I ask the chairperson, isn't it true that this is what you have proposed, 1 percentage point for military retirees, reduce the annual cost of living adjustment by 1 percentage point for military retirees, which means, according to the House Budget Committee staff, a person who enlisted at age 18 and retired at 38 as a sergeant first class in the Army would see approximately 6% overall reduction in lifetime pay because of the COLA reduction. That is, that person would receive about $1.626 million in lifetime retirement pay instead of $1.734 million. And so, as compared to what Simpson-Bowles envisions, complete elimination, as opposed to this 1% reduction. And I would also ask, again, to the budget chairman of the Budget Committee, isn't it true that this cost of living adjustment reduction, the 1%, doesn't kick in until 2015, the end of 2015? And isn't it true that Senator Levin and I and all others have committed to reviewing this provision with the outlook, at least in my view, to repealing it if necessary, but also there's a commission supported by members on both sides of the aisle which looks at this entire issue of cost of living adjustments, of retirement, of TRICARE, of all of these issues because of the increasing costs of these benefits, or in the words of Secretary Gates, former Secretary of Defense that all of us admired so much, it's, quote, eating us alive. So, again, the Simpson-Bowles plan, which was embraced by almost unanimously on both sides of the aisle, eliminates the cost of living adjustments for anyone during their working age retirees. This plan, which is met with such outrage, is only a 1% reduction, and as I say, for which, by the way, I want revised as well, that this would receive $1.6 million instead of $1.734 million. And finally, I would ask the distinguished chairperson, do you know of another plan, another idea, another legislative proposal that will prevent us from shutting down the government again? Something that I refuse to inflict on the citizens of my state. I refuse to disturb their lifestyles, to destroy their income, to shut down the essential government services, the nightmare that we just went through. So I guess my question is to the chairperson, do you know of another avenue between now, I believe it's January 15th, when the government would be shut down again, that we could pursue that would prevent another government shutdown?
Madam President, the senator from Arizona is entirely correct. There is no other legislation that can be brought before us at this time to prevent a government shutdown. As we know, the House of Representatives has gone home for the year. We know that without a bipartisan agreement before us, that the impacts across the country would be untenable. We've kind of been there. And on top of that, if we do not have this budget agreement, the military itself will take another $20 billion hit. So those very military personnel that all of us passionately care about would be facing layoffs, would be facing uncertainty, would be facing furloughs, would be facing tremendous hardship to themselves and to their families. So yes, the senator from Arizona is absolutely correct.
Well, I would further ask the chairperson if she has, as I have, heard from every single uniformed service leader of the 4 armed services, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that further effects of sequestration will do unsustainable damage to our national security, that the pain impacted because of the way that sequestration acts in 2014 with the really significant effects, that we will destroy or certainly dramatically impact our ability to defend this nation. And isn't that the unanimous opinion of our uniformed service commanders who we give the responsibility to defend this nation? I would ask the chairperson if she has heard from our military leadership in uniform as well on this entire proposal, particularly its effect on sequestration.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
The senator from Arizona is correct. I have heard from every single branch of our military service that the impacts in 2015, a few weeks from now, would be devastating if the current sequester continues to take place. And I would add to the senator from Arizona, coming from a state where we have a number of military bases, I've heard from the families of those soldiers and airmen and sailors that they are deeply worried about their loved ones and their lives if we don't replace the sequestration. And I want to personally thank him for his hard work and his support behind the scenes to help us get to where we are today, because without his voice in this, it would have been extremely difficult. And I carry his voice and many voices into that conference room to take some very tough choices forward so that those families, all the way up to those top generals, don't have to enact the further cuts of sequestration.
So if I may ask the chairperson in summary, 1, there is no legislative proposal between now and January 15th that anyone sees that could pass both houses of Congress and be signed by the President of the United States that would prevent another government shutdown on January 15th. I would ask the chairperson if that's true. Second, isn't it true that if we go through this sequestration again, particularly because of the nature of the sequester legislation, that there's a sharp drop in 2014 and then a sort of a restoration in following years? In other words, the worst year of the entire sequestration process would be next year unless we soften the blow. And isn't it true that nobody cares more about those who serve in the military than their uniformed leaders? And unanimously, those uniformed leaders have said that they support this legislation. And isn't it true that the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Armed Services Committee will have an entire year, because this legislation will not take effect, this cost of living adjustment will not take effect until January 15, until 2015. So we have an entire year of authorization committee consideration of this particular provision. And isn't it also true that it is recognized by all members of the Armed Services Committee and the Appropriations Committee and the chairman of the Budget Committee that we cannot have continued increases in costs and benefits forever because of our inability to fund our national security? In other words, the dramatic increase in personnel and benefit costs are such that we really aren't going to have money left over for the mission, the equipment, and the capabilities. So, and isn't it also true, I would report again, ask again what the obvious is, the Simpson-Bowles plan, which was embraced wholeheartedly by many of us, including this senator, by the way, said that the, and I quote, the defer cost of living adjustment for retirees and that's all cost of living adjustments for retirees in the current system until age 62. Isn't it far more draconian, what is envisioned in Simpson-Bowles, than what is before the body today? So is it hard to understand why someone would embrace Simpson-Bowles and yet find this provision as objectionable as it is? I find the provision objectionable. But I have confidence, and I hope that the Budget Committee chairperson would agree, that it deserves the review and legislating if it needs to be fixed, because the fact is that we have to look at the entire retirement and benefits that are now present in the military. For example, TRICARE, where there has not been an increase in premiums, I believe, since 1985, while the cost of health care has skyrocketed. So, again, I would ask the chairman of the Budget Committee if that's true, and if it's true, then doesn't it deserve some consideration for those who care, as I do, and I know the chairperson does, about the men and women who are serving in the military, and shouldn't we listen to our military leadership who literally are saying they cannot defend this nation if this sequestration continues, particularly in the Meat Act's fashion with which sequestration is now impacting our nation's defense.
Madam President.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I would agree with the senator from Arizona, and in fact, the often touted and quoted Simpson-Bowles Commission report, even in this debate over the last day, is much more egregious in what they are speaking about. But secondly, I agree with everything he said except for one thing. The senator from Arizona mentioned that we have a year to look at the commission report. It is actually 2 years before this goes into effect. Congress will have time to act. The Senate Armed Services Committee will be looking at the commission reports, and we will have an opportunity to look at this in entirety before it is implemented. And I truly want to thank him for speaking up for our military, because I know more than any one of us on this floor that when he speaks for the military, he understands the consequences of not enacting legislation today.
I thank the chairperson for her hard work, and I believe that most Americans are a bit surprised that there is any agreement. And I believe that the chairperson would agree that this is a small step. But I think the chairperson should also deserve and be accorded great credit for tough negotiating, for a good agreement that I think will achieve many things, but most of all, prevention of the shutdown of the government, again, which we should not and cannot inflict on the American people. And I would have, and I'm sure the chairperson would have had different provisions in it if she had written it herself, just as Congressman Ryan would have said the same thing. But this is the essence of what we're supposed to be doing. And the option of shutting down the government is something that I don't really understand why anybody, after what we just went through, would want to have as a viable option of our failure to act. So again, I thank the chairperson, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Washington.
I want to thank the senator from Arizona for his astute remarks and appreciate his help and support. And, Madam President, I do have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and be printed in the record.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Not, I yield to the senator from Arkansas. I apologize.
Who yields time?
Madam President.
The senator from Nebraska.
Thank you. If there isn't an objection, I ask for 6 to 8 minutes to speak as in morning business. I'll try to make this brief. I did sign up, and something came up, I guess. So if that's all right, I'll proceed.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Arkansas, and I thank the chair of the Budget Committee.
Madam President, I'm here on the floor today to voice strong objection to a federal agency that is disregarding the clear language of the law in pursuit of what has appeared time and time again to be what I describe as an anti-agriculture agenda with this administration. Let me explain. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is known as OSHA, is now claiming jurisdiction of all things of family farms, but they're doing that in defiance of Congress. For the past 35 years, literally 35 years, Madam President, Congress has included very specific language in appropriation bills. It prohibits OSHA from enforcement on small farms. Literally since 1976, the law has said very clearly no funds appropriated for OSHA can be used for rules or regulations that apply to farming operations with 10 or fewer employees. Clearly, what Congress is trying to do is provide protection for the family farms that exist in our states across this country. Yet, lo and behold, OSHA has decided it can label certain sections of the farm something else by fiat and send in their inspectors. Let me explain what has happened in Nebraska. OSHA targeted a family farm in rural Nebraska. They grow corn and soybeans and raise some cattle. This farm has one non-farm or non-family employee on that farm. In other words, it's a very typical Nebraska farm, just the kind of farm Congress envisioned in creating the exemption dating back to 1976. OSHA ignored what Congress directed. They ignored the law exempting farms and slapped this family farm with fines totaling more than $130,000. OSHA accused the farmer of willful violations. Let me give you a couple of examples. Failure to conduct atmospheric tests in a grain bin. Failure to wear OSHA-approved gear when entering the grain bin, just to name a few. Madam President, you can't make this stuff up. I kid you not. The violations I listed were $28,000 each, with a long list of lesser violations piled on top. They threw the book at this farmer. Let me be clear that OSHA made no claim that anyone had been hurt. They claimed only that the farm failed to comply with the OSHA manual. I'm sure the farmer was stunned to find OSHA inspectors on his farm out in the middle of Nebraska, and to be told he suddenly must comply with OSHA regulations. Knowing the law says his farm is exempt from OSHA regulations, I suspect he was rightly confused, angry, and frustrated. OSHA claimed that it was not regulating the farming operation at all. Rather, it was only regulating the non-farming operations. Congress had not exempted the non-farming parts of farms, right? So what was this non-farming activity that OSHA believes it can regulate? Grain storage. Grain storage. I grew up on a farm, Madam President. Every farm has grain storage. It has hay storage. It has silage storage. Can they regulate the farming operations relative to those items? Yep, that's right. OSHA, in their wisdom, says storing grain after a harvest allows them to go in and regulate this farm. I'm not sure how many OSHA employees have spent much time on a farm. I suspect not very many. But there aren't too many grain farms that don't store some of their grain. An iconic part of the agricultural landscape is grain bins. They're fundamental to farming and have been since I grew up on a farm. If farmers had to sell everything at harvest, they wouldn't make much money because that's when prices typically are the lowest. So it is only responsible for a farmer in a part of the farming operation to have grain bins on the farm, and it's been that way forever. OSHA's claim that the storage of grain is not part of farming is absolutely incredible, and it's absurd. It's also a blatant overreach in violation of the law that we have been passing in Congress dating back to 1976. Whenever I meet with farmers and ranchers in Nebraska, they often raise concern about regulatory overreach. In fact, they feel like they're targeted by this administration. OSHA's distorted definition of farming in order to expand its jurisdiction serves as evidence that farmers' concerns are legitimate concerns. OSHA should never be allowed to end-run the law in this manner. Now, I'm asking Labor Secretary Perez to rein in OSHA and send a clear signal to American farmers that they don't have a target on their backs. OSHA must rescind its absurd guidance suggesting that grain bins, of all things, are not a part of the farming operation, and it must stop sending inspectors onto family farms in violation of the law. I've drafted and I'm sending a letter to Secretary Perez, a letter requesting that he make these changes in compliance with the law. And I'm inviting all of my colleagues to join me in signing that letter. Madam President, let me conclude by just saying let's stand with our nation's family farmers, which we have done since 1976. Let's rein in this regulatory overreach and send a message that federal agencies must abide by the clear direction of Congress. Madam President, I thank you again. I thank the senators on the floor for the courtesy, and I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Arkansas.
Madam President, today I rise to discuss the pending budget agreement. First, I'd like to praise Senator Murray and Congressman Ryan for their hard work